I want to speak today about biodiversity and ecosystems and the role they play in supporting human well-being and environmental security. Most of us think of biodiversity in terms of some of the iconic species like the dugong, the whale shark, dolphins, turtles here in Sri Lanka, and in Africa, majestic animals like the elephant, the rhino and the lion. But there are literally millions of other animals that we take for granted that are far from being unimportant. They're actually the workers that support ecosystem functions, and it's those functions in ecosystems that provide the services to man that give us our food, our livelihoods, and clean water, clean air, and mitigate our climate, forests, and provide a whole range of other indirect services that we perhaps don't notice in our normal day-to-day lives. Worldwide, there are thought to be at least 10 million different species of animals, plants, and other organisms. And we've only identified and described maybe 15% of those. So it means that 85% of all biological life on the planet is still relatively unknown to man. So this is the natural capital that we have to protect, and by protecting it, we make it available for future benefits. And it's not just poor people that need the benefit of biodiversity. Many of the drugs and other medicines that we depend on for our health actually come from nature. It's estimated that at least half of all the cancer-fighting drugs come from nature, from coral reefs and from rainforest plants. So if we lose that biodiversity capital, we are destroying opportunities in the future to identify and use life-saving drugs. And these include drugs from nature that fight heart disease, that are immune suppressants that can be used as anti-cancer drugs, and can treat a whole range of other life-threatening diseases and ailments. It's like having a bank account. We put money into a bank account as our capital, and we try then to live on the interest. We don't want to have to spend the capital in our account. And biodiversity is like nature's capital. We want to make use of it, use the interest that it generates by providing our food, regulating our climate, keeping our water clean, and giving us access to potentially valuable drugs and medicines. But we don't want to erode that capital and therefore lose the benefit that it will generate to us. So many of the millions of species on the planet that we don't notice are actually the ones that are providing the ecosystem functions that support the goods and services that we utilize. I want to consider in particular the mangrove forests, which are part of the coastal ecosystems of Sri Lanka. And these unique trees and other plants that live in brackish water are very limited in their diversity. There's only around 70 species worldwide. So if we lose even 1 or 2 species of mangrove, we are eroding into our capital in a very serious way. And already, although mangroves appear to be quite common still, IUCN has estimated that about 15% of all the mangrove species are already threatened with extinction. But those 70 mangrove plant species are supporting literally hundreds of animal species, ranging from birds to insects from the land, intertidal animals like crabs and mollusks, mussels, oysters, and so on, and myriads of aquatic animals that enter the mangrove at high tide to feed. And these include commercially important fish, shrimp in particular, and crabs. And the best known crab is the mud crab, or as it's known right across this region, the Sri Lankan jumbo crab, a very high value animal that people love to eat in restaurants. And the point is here that these hundreds of animals are entirely dependent on the habitat that the mangrove trees provide. So if we allow mangroves to be cut down or degraded or polluted, we are not risking the loss of just a small number of mangrove tree species. We're risking eliminating or greatly diminishing literally hundreds of other species of value to man as food and as part of a much more complex marine ecosystem where the mangroves are linked very closely with other marine ecosystems like the coral reefs and the seagrass beds, because fish in particular move at different times in their life histories between mangroves, corals and seagrasses. So we have to manage mangroves and the other marine ecosystems as very closely interlinked. They're interconnected. And so we need to take a very integrated approach to coastal management and not to think of mangroves as only trees or corals as only something living under the water. We have to think of managing on an integrated basis by an approach that we call the ecosystem-based approach. And that recognizes that animals, plants, and the physical environment, the water. I want to say something now about forests and biodiversity and livelihoods. Moving away from the coast to the terrestrial forests and watersheds, we find that still today, as many as 1.6 billion people are forest dependent. They live in forest areas, they have converted the forest to smallholder farmland, and they still live in very close association with the biodiversity that forests support. And not only is it the sheer numbers of people still dependent on forests, but 25% of poor people are forest dependent, and among the very poor, the figure is as high as 90%. So there's a dilemma for us here, that so many people depend on forests, but that has meant that in many cases they've cut the forest to create agricultural land. So this has put immense pressure on the biodiversity that forests support, and it means that in many cases people are struggling to maintain their livelihood support from the forest that they are so dependent on. So how can we overcome the dilemma that people living in and near forests are so dependent on forest resources, and yet they can't afford the luxury of just leaving the forest to be conserved, because their livelihoods depend on utilizing the plants and animals that the forest provides to them, or the land that the forest once grew on. One new approach in management is called Payment for Ecosystem Services, or PES. And this basically is a voluntary approach which regards those that benefit from forest resources as being the people that should pay for that use. And the money that they pay in order to use forest resources should go to those living in the forests, who can use that money to offset their livelihood needs so that they can afford to be the conservators of the forest, but still gain a livelihood in that role. And the principle of PES is very simple. If we look at an example from Vietnam where it's working in practice, up in the watershed forests in some of the highland provinces of Vietnam, there is a lot of water supplied to generate hydroelectricity. And the hydroelectric companies are now paying for every hectare of forest to be protected by the local community. So the money that the community earns now offsets the need to exploit the forest resources and destroy biodiversity. So in the past, they earned very little from conservation. Today, as much as 75% of their income is generated from payments they receive from the hydroelectric companies. The cost of the forest protection is then passed on to the consumers of the electricity. So people living in Ho Chi Minh City, which is the recipient of most of the electricity, pay a small supplement on their electricity bill of about 2% to offset the cost of the payments that go back to the families living in the forest areas that are protecting the forest. The result of this is that the consumer of the electricity is the ultimate buyer of the forest protection service. And for the local people, it means they now have a reasonable income that is not dependent on exploiting the forest in the traditional way. We have another example of payment for ecosystem services that's also very new and innovative, and this regards the production of shrimp in coastal areas. Previously, mangrove forests were destroyed to build intensive shrimp farms, and there were lots of examples here in Sri Lanka of attempts to do this. Intensive shrimp farming failed because it polluted itself. Too much waste from the shrimp, waste food, very quickly polluted the water, and that led to diseases which killed the shrimp stock. Today, in a number of countries like Vietnam and Thailand, we are returning to an integrated system where the mangrove forest is part of the pond environment. And farmers in Vietnam are now able to farm shrimp without adding chemicals, without adding any artificial food. They are benefiting entirely from the natural productivity of the mangrove forest. They retain 50% of the land area under mangrove forest. The other 50% is the water area where they can rear shrimp. And those shrimp have a very attractive market price because consumers in Europe are willing to pay a premium to buy organically farmed shrimp. So the farmers today gain a premium of 5 to 10% on the price of shrimp because they're being farmed organically. The system is sustainable because of the mangrove and the environmental services that the mangrove provides by keeping the water clean, providing a rich source of natural food for the shrimp, and moderating the pond climate. And in addition to the shrimp that the farmer can sell organically, there's a lot of other natural productivity that he benefits from. Wild shrimp, wild crab, and wild fish all add to the overall productivity of the farm and therefore to the farmer's income. And this system of organic shrimp farming is now catching on very quickly. It's driven ultimately by the consumer in Europe in this case, that is demanding to know where food supplies are coming from, wanting to know that food that we eat in Europe is produced in a healthy way without the addition of chemicals and other additives, and the consumer seeking to know that the producer of the food is receiving a fair payment for the products that are produced from nature. So these are two examples of what we now know as payment for ecosystem services. And of course, this is where the private sector can take the lead, because it's a voluntary transaction between the buyer of an environmental service and the person who can protect the supply of that service, the farmer or the fisherman or the shrimp farmer. And therefore it can be driven by the private sector with consumers as the ultimate buyers of those services. So it's a very exciting new approach to conservation and the protection of biodiversity that I think in future years will become an extremely important aspect of conserving our ecosystems and the biodiversity that supports them. The other aspect of biodiversity links directly to business. The business and biodiversity concept, again, is growing in interest. And it's very important because the private sector can take a very responsible lead in supporting biodiversity conservation, not just for corporate social responsibility reasons, but actually because biodiversity conservation can contribute to business success and particularly to the sustainability of businesses and reducing risks of environmental impacts.